Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Philip Andrew Speed from the Energy Studies Institute, one floor up here, and I welcome you to this joint ISAS-ESI Seminar on India's global energy engagements. And this is part of an ongoing collaboration between the two institutes. The most recent was a conference and workshop last November on South Asia's sustainable energy transition. So this is, and I think with Raja Mohan, Christopher Len and myself and our director have already met him, and we look forward to building maybe a more regular program of not necessarily big conferences but smaller events that can roll out over 2019. But that's still in the planning stage, so I wouldn't want to jump ahead too much. So we're delighted and honoured to have with us Mr. Vikram Mehta, who worked for a different oil company than I did. I'm BP, his Shell, but we're prepared now in retirement to sit next to each other. But anyway, he had many, many more years' experience in the oil industry and at a much higher level, having been chairman of Shell and now is executive chair of Brookings India, still the most recent overseas centre for Brookings, is it? Is that
yes,
what it says on your website?
Yes.
Okay, and Brookings is one of the US and Washington's most illustrious think tanks, so I think it's great that there is. I've worked with the Brookings Institute at Tsinghua University in China, and it's great that we have one a little nearer to us in South Asia, so that's really exciting. And with his international oil experience, and he's now working with the government, as he started nearly 40 years ago, working in the Indian government. You're very well placed to tell us about India's strategies, ambitions and outcomes of its international energy engagements. And this is a personal interest to me because I've worked, nearly 30 years ago I was working for BP in China, and in 1993 was when China started to go out, and this has been my objects of study, not looking just China inside, but China's internationalization of energy, oil, gas, nuclear, wind, solar, whatever. And we all read about that in the newspapers, and some people actually may understand it. But the Indian story is rather more subtle and less understood and less well documented. So I think it's great to have Mr. Mehta here with us. So if you would turn your phones to silent, I will hand over, including you, sir. Yes.
I know I left it behind.
That's all right. Okay. Mr. Mehta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew. I'm actually grateful to the Institute for inviting me, and I'm particularly honored that amongst all of you there are two very, very senior Indian former government officials who probably know more about the subject than I do, Dr. Subbarao and Dr. Vinod Rai. But in that they know the dynamics of government of India and how it operates in a more intimate, sort of nuanced way than I do. What I wanted to do today was really address the subject matter of India's global engagement by presenting facts and by then suggesting certain sort of policy conundrums that confront the government in order to address the issues arising from those facts. I'm going to be focused entirely on India's global engagement vis-a-vis the energy sector. So I won't go into some of the issues that we face domestically, and there are many, many issues that the Indian energy sector needs to tackle domestically. I'm just going to address the external dimension of our energy problem. But let me put this subject into context. India's energy sector and energy crisis, and I use the word crisis deliberately, arises from three factors. One, demand for energy is surging. Two, the supply of energy is not keeping pace with demand. And 3, the environment is under great stress. Now, the demand for energy is surging because of the rise of our population, because of increasing urbanization, and because of the cumulative impact of policies that have encouraged the wasteful consumption of energy in the country. Whether it was subsidized pricing, whether it's inefficiency in the usage of energy, whether it was the lack of coordination amongst our different sort of government agencies, the fact is that policies have contributed also to the rise of demand of energy in the country. Supply has not kept pace with the demand for energy, in part because we have constrained resources, in part because our policies have also been less encouraging of investment in domestic exploration and production, in part because the infrastructure that we need in order to access energy and bring it to the consumer has not been adequately created, and in part because the pricing mechanism has discouraged appropriate investments. The environment is under stress, and I don't think I need to elaborate on that, because fossil fuels are polluting, and we simply have not done enough to address the issues related to the consequences of excessive use of coal, oil, and gas, and inadequate investments, until recently at least, in cleaner energies. So this is a sort of a very broad, simplified backdrop to the energy problem that we face. The consequence of, well, before I go to the consequence, the current government has sought to address this crisis by actually specifying very clearly their objectives. There have been many government documents which seek to spell out the policy objectives of the government. And the most recent such document is one produced by the Niti Aayog, which is the successor organization to the Planning Commission. It's the government think tank, in effect. And the Niti Aayog has, in June, pulled together a policy document which summarizes the objectives of India's energy policy as to be one. We need to provide access at affordable prices. 2, energy policy must improve our security and also self-reliance. 3, energy must be, we must focus on the sustainability of energy resources, of energy supply. And finally, all these factors must contribute to the growth of the Indian economy. So in effect, their policy objectives are access at affordable prices, energy security, sustainability, and growth. Now, in order to actually achieve these stated objectives, the government document, not just simply as stated in the Niti Aayog, but also in other documents, has spelled out a set of strategic directions, which I think should be also, I just want to just lay them out again as a backdrop before I discuss India's external engagements. So the strategic objectives, or the objectives that the government has, one is a very straightforward, determined objective. Every single village in India must be electrified by 2018, and all households must have universal electrification by 2022. Secondly, they want to reduce the import of oil by 10% by 2022. Thirdly, government has determined that the emissions intensity must be reduced by 33 to 35% by 2030 over the figure in 2005. This has actually been stated as part of their Paris obligation. A fourth objective, which is one that has acquired quite a bit of publicity and has been debated and discussed a lot, is the objective to create 175 gigawatts of capacity in renewables by 2030, of which 100 gigawatts would be solar and 60 gigawatts would come from wind. The balance would be a mix of bio and hydro and so on. The big issue in India, as some of you who have who know the Indian sort of economy or have studied the Indian economy know full well, is that most of our distribution companies that buy electricity are insolvent. So this is now also a major objective, to repair the balance sheets of our distribution companies. So here are a set of objectives. To add to those objectives, there are also now very clear statements regarding technology, access to clean energy technology, and to create an appropriate ecosystem that would generate more efficient usage of energy. Now, I'm putting all this. I'm giving you this as a backdrop because it's important to keep this in mind in order to discuss the policies that we need to address or need to develop in order to address the issues that arise from our global energy involvement. Now, let me just focus on our external sort of relations. I'll address this by focusing separately on oil, coal, and gas. Now, as I said in my opening remark, demand and supply are mismatched. As a consequence of that, we have become increasingly dependent on imports. Now, when you focus on oil, today India imports 82% of its oil requirements, and this presents a huge burden on our exchequer, on our foreign exchange. Last year, the bill was $28.3 billion. We import about 160 million tons of crude oil every year, and the largest supplier of crude oil into India is Iraq. They contribute 45 million tons, followed by Iran now, but if you take it on an annualized figure, it's actually Saudi Arabia. On a 2017-18 fiscal year, Saudi Arabia, we imported 36 million tons of crude from Saudi Arabia, followed by Iran, 27 million tons, and then Nigeria and Venezuela, which have 18 million tons each, contribute 18 million tons each, and then the UAE, 14 million tons. So if you think about it, 160 million tons of crude are imported into India. 36 million tons of that are actually coming from non-Middle Eastern countries, that is Venezuela and Nigeria. So we are very heavily dependent on imports from the Middle East, and we come back to this, but of this, Iran contributes 27 million tons, and we need to discuss the consequences of the sanctions that Trump has imposed on Iran and the implications for India of that. Saudi contributes 36 million tons, and we need to also talk about the implications of Saudi Arabia's relationship with some of its Gulf neighbors, with whom we also have a very strong relationship, and how we can handle that. But so, just to put it in the proper perspective, oil, we have, as I say, a very strong dependence on the Middle East, on the Gulf countries. When we come to gas, we import 45% of the gas that's consumed in India. And all of it is actually imported in the form of liquefied natural gas, LNG. So currently we have 4 terminals for regasifying the liquefied natural gas. All 4 of them are on the west coast. There are 3 currently under construction on the east coast, and one of the existing 2, and there are 2 more actually under construction or have just about to be commissioned on the west coast. But the important point here is that over the last 5 years, our import of LNG into India has increased from 13 million tons in 2012 to 19.63 million tons in the last fiscal year. It's a very substantive increase of LNG into India. The major supplier of LNG into India is Qatar, with whom we have a long-term supply contract. And this is important to keep in mind because of the relationship between Qatar and Saudi Arabia. So Qatar is a very important supplier of gas into India, and Saudi Arabia, as I already mentioned, is a very important supplier of oil into India. The other suppliers of gas into India are Australia and the USA. And a month ago, we brought in the first shipment of gas, LNG, from Russia. So the Government of India company, the state company, Gas Authority of India, has signed a 20-year long-term supply agreement with Gazprom, which is the gas company, the Russian gas company, to supply 4.5 million tons of gas every year. And we have a long-term supply contract also with the USA. So in addition to the relationships that we have with the Gulf countries for oil, we now have also a deepening relationship with not just Qatar, but also now with Australia, USA, and possibly Russia as regard to gas. So just to keep, that broadens our external sort of, engagements to that extent. Then we look at coal. Now, coal, you might be surprised to learn, is also imported into India. I mean, we have the 5th largest deposits of coal in the world, and yet the country imports a fairly significant slug of coal into the country, into India. In fact, the last year, the import of thermal coal into India increased by 8%, and the imports of coking coal by 13%. Thermal coal is used for power generation, coking coal is used for steel. This does not, it's not a very positive statement to make about India's coal industry, but that's a separate issue. The fact is that we are importing coal into the country as well. And we imported last year $20 billion worth of coal into India, which is, as I say, not an insignificant slug of money. Now, the major supplier of coal into India is Australia, coking coal, followed by USA and Indonesia. Indonesia provides 3/5 of our thermal coal imports. And then also there's South Africa. So again, the map of our energy relationships broadens even further, if you see what I mean. Now that's as far as the imports are concerned. Now if we now take a slightly different sort of look at the external engagements from a slightly different perspective, and we ask ourselves, what has been our overseas acquisitions? Has India actually made acquisitions overseas? And the answer is yes. We have, through our ONGC, through a subsidiary of our major upstream company, ONGC, investments in 42 projects in 20 different countries. The subsidiary is called ONGC Videsh, OVL, and we have equity crude oil of about 9 million tons per annum. That is, our access to crude oil is approximately 9 million tons. As I said, spread over 20 different countries. Now, the spread does not actually have any geographic logic to it. OVL or ONGC goes wherever the oil is or wherever they feel the oil is. So they're in Brazil, they're in Colombia, they're in Sudan, they're in Sakhalin in Russia, they're in Central Asia. But the larger point to make here is that this is Government of India assets which are being invested in these oil-producing fields, and in some senses, these assets are being guaranteed by the Government of India's balance sheet. So that's another dimension to our energy, you might say, engagement. Then finally, in some senses, we have to look at our involvement with the multilateral agencies. Here we have not been actively engaged. It's only last year that we became a member of the IEA, the International Energy Agency, as an associate member. We can't be a full member because we are not a member of the OECD. But it's taken us a fairly long period of time to accept that we wish to be a member of the IEA as an associate member. And that has certain sort of positives to it. It gives us, it doesn't give us access to the strategic reserves, but at least allows us to discuss the issues that arise or that would have to be tackled in the event of a major supply disruption. We are also a co-founder of the International Solar Alliance, and that's something that's based in India, and that here we are pretty active. Outside the area, other than the fossil fuel, that is oil, gas, and coal, I just want to also identify one other emerging and significant sort of international relation, and that is with China, and it is to do with solar. We have as I said, a very aggressive plan to increase our solar generation capacity. The competitiveness of our solar industry depends very much on access to solar panels at a competitive price. China offers the cheapest solar panels today. The Government of India is worried at our excessive dependence on the Chinese imports of solar panels, and they did earlier this year impose a 25% duty on Chinese imports. Those duties have had to be stayed because the domestic suppliers of solar energy have stated that their economics were premised on being able to access panels from China, and so the government has stayed this particular duty increase. But the larger point here is that the economics of our sort of renewable energy depends very much on imports, and in currently, at least, those imports, whether it's of solar panels or even of battery technology, is coming from China. And you can just imagine the debate must be going on within the country as to how do we. Well, we can't sort of go from the reducing dependence on oil imports to sudden dependence on Chinese for competitive access or access to competitive components for generating our solar or our renewable energy. So, in sum, if you were to think about the map of India's energy engagements, you were really talking about, the Gulf as far as oil is concerned, talking about gas, you're talking about Australia, and gas and coal is Australia predominantly, and then you're talking in some senses about Australia, about the USA, which is oil and not oil will also happen, oil, gas, and to a lesser extent also coal. Now, what are the kind of issues that that we are faced with when we deal with this sort of fairly disparate group of countries? Well, firstly, most of our relationship with these countries has been transactional. We're looking at the supply contracts, whether they're short-term contracts or long-term contracts, but they're transactional contracts. They're not really been embedded or built on a strategic sort of consideration of what it is that we would like out of these relationships. Secondly, some of those relationships that we have resulted in, as I say, the acquisition of assets, but we have not been able to establish how do we protect those assets in the event of a geopolitical upheaval. Remember, some of our assets are in countries that are facing domestic strife, and that's a big issue for us. Yeah, Sudan, for example, Venezuela, for example, Colombia, Nigeria. We've already faced a problem there, and if I was to give you, tell you about the number of times we've actually had to declare force majeure, you'd be surprised. It's the big issue for us here is that we have not established a clear institutional mechanism within the country for handling our energy, our global energy engagements. We have multiple ministries. So there's the Ministry of Coal that handles the coal. There's the Ministry of Petroleum that handles oil and gas. There's the Ministry of Renewable Energy, which would handle the issues related to solar and wind. The Ministry of Commerce and Industry would be concerned about whether to, impose duties or not. There's the Niti Aayog, which does not have any executive authority, which probably is the only body that is looking at energy through an integrated or a holistic sort of lens. There's the Ministry of External Affairs, that is our Foreign Office, which has no doubt a locus, a jurisdictional authority over all of our overseas engagement because they're the Foreign Office, but they don't know they're not experts, they don't have domain expertise. So if you think about it, here is the energy sector, which is actually heavily engaged in, or heavily invested in the global market, but which does not have an agency in the country that takes an holistic overview of how we can deploy, if you will, the balance sheet of India Inc. in order to enhance the competitiveness of our overtures or our initiatives overseas. That's our big issue. And the problem here is that we still haven't been able to establish who should be the coordinating agency. So the Niti Aayog has actually suggested that it should be the Ministry of External Affairs. I'm not sure that the Ministry of External Affairs has the expertise to be able to do it. But then in the absence of the Ministry of External Affairs, there is no Ministry of Energy in the country, if you see. There are these different ministries. I would personally advocate that we create this coordinating mechanism under the Prime Minister's office, or in the Prime Minister's office. But I mean, I'd be happy to, get pushed back on that. The only reason I say that is because the alternative to that would be to actually create a Minister of Energy, or a Minister of a Minister responsible for for India's energy investments overseas. But I think that's kind of structural change, maybe a step too far, perhaps. So I'm saying, in the absence of looking for a major step change, let's maybe start with a smaller step, which would be looking at creating something in the Prime Minister's office, which has already become a huge office, and giving someone at the rank of a Minister of State responsibility for bringing together all of these very different sort of assets and making sure that India's interests are protected. And it's important to make this point because the bulk of these investments that I've talked about are actually being made by Indian state-owned companies. They have not been made by the private sector. Very few private companies have invested overseas. There are exceptions, like the Adani Group has invested in Australian coal, but the Adani Group is now facing a huge backlash in Queensland. Okay, the Reliance Group invested in shale oil in America. They've sold out on their investments in America. There are, of course, other smaller groups which have sought to make investment, but they're not material relative to the kind of investments I'm talking about. The largest investments have been made by the Indian public sector, and that's why it's probably important that the government of India sees this, recognize that this is something that they need to address holistically. The other important reason for doing this holistically is that they're competing against, in most places, China. And China actually does back their state-owned companies with the balance sheets of China Inc. You get China actually going out there and offering investments that may have no connection with the specifics of energy. Like they would like to, they want an equity acreage in, say, Nigeria, and they're prepared to invest in in the construction of a railroad. There are these sort of, tie-ins that the Chinese are prepared to do. We can't compete against the Chinese unless we are also prepared to actually take, as I've said repeatedly, we take an integrated view. So that's another reason why it's exceedingly important that we sort out this institutional issue as quickly as possible. A third important sort of reason for looking at our international sort of energy engagement through a holistic view is that we are facing, we're going to face a number of challenges that arise from the geopolitics, arise from international geopolitics. So just take one example. Trump has decided to reimpose sanctions on Iran. Iran is, as I already indicated, a major supplier of crude oil into our country. Trump's decisions are, change from day to day, not from day to day, from week to week maybe. One day he's imposed sanctions, next day he calls for direct dialogue with the Iranians. Should India actually ignore Trump's demand to reduce its imports of Iranian crude oil to zero by November the 6th? If it were to ignore it, what would be the consequences for India? If it did not ignore it and did reduce its imports to zero, what would be the consequences? Well, certainly in the latter case, it has enough, it can easily, very quickly, replace the crude oil that is currently importing from Iran by turning to Saudi, Kuwait, Iraq. the blend of crude oil that it receives from Iran can be replaced by these other countries. It would be more expensive, but it can be. So that would not be it would not face a material it would not be a materially regressive move for it if it did indeed reduce its imports of crude oil from Iran. But on the other hand, it would definitely undermine its relationship with a very important supplier of crude, long-term supplier of crude. So this is a conundrum for India. How should it handle it? It cannot and should not be handled just through the Ministry of External Affairs. Similarly, Saudi Arabia and Qatar at loggerheads. How should it reconcile that issue? It's already facing a lot of questions on that. Saudi Arabia would like India to reduce its gas imports from Qatar. The cheapest gas comes to us from Qatar. We simply cannot afford to do that. Okay? Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, through Aramco, wants to invest in a major refinery on the west coast of India. Plus, of course, as you all know, Aramco is sort of the vehicle through which MBS, this Crown Prince, hopes to realize his vision, and India is part of that his scheme of things. So again, that's a conundrum. So this again cannot be handled just through the Middle East, to the Ministry of External Affairs. And finally, and I'll stop and let, and that is the issue of technology. We need to access technology. We need access technology to do with a whole range of issues, not just to do with how do we improve the recovery rate of crude oil from our domestic fields. Currently, the recovery rate is 28%, whereas the recovery rate from fields of comparable geology is 40–45%. We really do need to do something about that. We need technology to actually improve, to create clean energy solutions, whether it's battery technology, storage technology. We need technology to stabilize our grid, otherwise we're not going to be able to scale up renewables. This technology, and I can go on, is accessible to us off the shelf, provided we have, again, an integrated view of how to approach it. This cannot happen through the Ministry of External Affairs, because they don't have that domain knowledge. We have to create, therefore, a very different agency through which we address India's energy requirements overseas. Let me stop here.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you, Mr. Mehta. That was a all-encompassing overview of, I think very good. You started domestically, because all international energy activities generally start with domestic issues, and it's the same in China. And I'm just going to sort of take us in one direction initially. It's the coordination problem. And I worked on China for nearly 30 years, and most of the time they are uncoordinated as well. Where they are coordinated, as you identified, is in certain countries where the energy company goes. There is a sort of China Inc. approach, but not everywhere. But actually, if you look at the energy sector, it's extremely uncoordinated, which is, so even PetroChina, okay, they would say we're going to invest so much in whatever, it would go up to the planning commission who would just say bomb. And of course, that's where China got itself into trouble, whereas India, ONGC, has underinvested overseas, one might say. China has overinvested, and that's why most of the previous leadership of PetroChina are in prison, because every time they invested, they have kickbacks, and they were overinvesting. And I had an ex-student in the middle of the finance department of PetroChina who 6–8 years ago said to me, these guys are out of hand, they're out of control, just spending money all over the place in an uncontrolled manner. So yes, sometimes China looks coordinated in certain countries, but still on the big picture, there's no Ministry of Energy, there's no absolute coordination, except, I think, in certain countries like Iran and Nigeria and Sudan. So yeah, I think for all these big countries going overseas with state money, coordination is the problem. Anyway, I throw it open to the floor for people to pick up whichever strands are being thrown open to haul in. Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming from behind.
Thank you, Mr. Mehta, for your wonderful presentation. I'm Rahul, and I'm the ISAS only. I'm a visiting fellow here. I have two questions. Do you like to share the domestic consumption of energy, the breakups of the energy? How much is industrial consumption? How much is domestic? Or is there anything available? And another is, you mentioned that India wants to reduce its consumption of energy, around 10% energy by 2022, if I'm not wrong. And what are the sectors? What are the sectors we can reduce? Which are where we can reduce the industrial consumption or domestic consumption or whatever it is? How will you do that?
Do you prefer to rotate? Okay,
Yeah.
we'll take 2 or 3 questions. Yes, anybody else? Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming from behind you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Mehta. You alluded to several times to the lack of coordination amongst different departments in the government. And you've had extensive experience on both sides of the fence, within the public sector as well as the private sector. May I ask you to think out loud on why is it, I mean, if you look at it from incentive structures and the need to coordinate and efficient allocation of resources, what is it that's impeding the public authorities from getting their act together?
Is it structures or interests? Yes. Yes. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Vikram, I want to come back to the renewables and specifically to the issue of solar power. You know, we are familiar with this development that India has a policy of encouraging solar panels, which have primarily local content into it. The matter went to the WTO under dispute. India lost the case, and then tariffs were increased on imported solar. Now, I understand the point that when it comes to domestic manufacturers of solar panel, that incentive is required, that yes, their local content has to be encouraged. But if one looks at it from the perspective of solar producers, the power producers, then their biggest efficiency gain is from cheaper input, where the Chinese products or imported products from anywhere have a distinct advantage. Now, the question that I have for you is that at a point in time when these solar power prices in India are dropping very, very sharply through auctions, how much of economic sense does it make to maintain this restriction? You know, from producers' perspective, because the price premiums are coming down. Even then, does the producer have to necessarily go for an indigenously available product at a higher cost? Doesn't it squeeze the bottom lines from a producer's perspective with falling prices, but then we are putting the producer onto something where the production cost has to be necessarily higher? The second question that I had in this regard is that with the prices falling of solar power, the prospects of raising funding for financing solar projects, and I'm not talking about rooftop projects, but generally somewhat bigger project. Utility projects. Bank financing is questionable, so the option that most of the producers are preferring are essentially bonds, if green bonds could be available or such kind of bonds. But here again, I just wanted your reaction on the Indian market, the depth of the Indian market for green bonds. How feasible is this an alternative, or does the Indian manufacturer of solar power has to by default rely on the international market for raising funds?
Can I, given that we got onto the solar subject, I had a dimension there which directly ties into your question, which is the solar about a month ago, the Chinese government put a squeeze to slow down the domestic deployment of solar PV. okay, which means the manufacturers are looking overseas. Why not get them to build plants, joint venture plants in India, as they've already built in Malaysia, to avoid, again, the WTO problem? So can you not get the Chinese to invest in India, hire in Indian labour force, maybe even set up research centres in India? So you work together rather than feeling that they're pushing you out. You take advantage but bring them in. So that's just a follow on there. So why don't we, there's quite a big agenda, you follow whichever strands you want to follow.
Right. So let me just first address the issue of solar. Yeah, the point I think I was making also, I probably didn't make very clearly, is that the economics of the solar producer has been driven by access to cheaper panels. Prices have fallen to a level which makes solar competitive against not quite yet domestic coal, but certainly against imported coal. I mean, the latest bid that came in, if I remember, is at ₹2.44 a kilowatt hour. That's, I think, 35 cents. That is very close to what industry would be paying for power, from based on from power based on domestic coal. The question really is whether whether this price gives the producer an economic return. Let's assume it does. I mean, they of course claim it does, otherwise they wouldn't bid it. But what is their margin? What is the buffer? And I believe that they simply have no room to switch from Chinese panels to domestic panels. That's basically the bottom line. And that 25% duty surcharge that was placed on Chinese solar panels killed their economics totally. So there is this big issue, as I say, between dependence on Chinese imports versus the economics of domestic solar. Now, versus, of course, the economics of domestic solar panel manufacturers. So there are manufacturers in India, Adani being one, that are arguing very strongly for protection. But they don't have the scale economies. They simply are not able to generate sufficient scale economies to produce at a competitive price. The other problem, by the way, that is arising now in our solar industry is that the distribution companies are refusing to honor their PPAs, their purchasing power agreements.
From the solar PV
From
panels.
the solar.
Okay.
So they were if you look at the range of prices that have been contracted between the solar producers and the distribution companies, it goes from 5 rupees to 244. So the lower the price, or as the prices start reducing, the companies or distribution companies that have actually signed off at a higher price are now negotiating to rewrite their PPAs, which in turn is of course putting a huge strain on the solar producers. So this whole industry is facing a bit of a crisis. I mean, we read about the fairly dramatic progress that's been made, but we sometimes forget that most of our solar producers are facing a challenge of receivables. The capacity is there, they're not getting paid, and there is an issue here. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question directly, but I think there is this big issue. Okay, I think I wish we were rational in our relationships with the overseas community and world, and if so, then we wouldn't be we would be looking for the cheapest sort of relation, the most effective, the most cost competitive kind of organizational structure, joint venture. And in that case, of course, in that situation, a Chinese investment in India might well work. But that ain't going to happen because of the nature of our political relationship with China. China dumps, and I put that, and actually I've turned to Dr. Subarao maybe, but I at least know from the couple of boards that I'm on that China has been selling products, not just solar panels, but a lot of other products into India at prices that make the domestic industry uncompetitive. Tires, for example. And there is a backlash against Chinese imports into India and therefore Chinese industry. I don't see Indian government or even Indian industry accepting Chinese partners in India. Indian industry might welcome a Chinese partner for sheer economic reasons, but they would fear the political consequences of having a Chinese partner, in India because of the political reasons. So I think we have to go out on our own, or we have to have a partner that comes from another part of the world. Yeah, why is there a lack of coordination? I mean, I certainly will welcome the sort of input from Dr. Rai or Dr. Subara, who have spent 40 years in the government, and I spent only 2 years. But I will say that I think one of the biggest weaknesses of the institutional structures that address the energy sector was the fact that we had these siloed approach. Okay? Until 2014, by the way, we had 7 different cabinet ministers, okay, not ministers of state, cabinet ministers dealing with energy. Mr. Modi, Prime Minister Modi, combined 4 of them into one ministry, or 3 of them. Renewables, coal, and power came under one came under one minister of state, actually, not even the cabinet minister. Okay, but the bureaucracy as such remains siloed. So there's the permanent undersecretary, the secretaries are still the secretary for energy, secretary for renewables, secretary for coal, secretary for power, secretary for petroleum, secretary for nuclear or atomic. There's and each of them have their own, you might say, lines of responsibility and accountability. It doesn't work. It simply does not work. And the reason I think it was done, it was never like that before. And, in 1991, we did have a Minister of Energy. We did have one person who actually was, I think it was Saras Pawar, one of the cabinet ministers. He was actually responsible I've forgotten his name, but there was one person, very senior. It was almost ranking the same level as the foreign minister, as the finance minister, as the defense minister. But then it split. I don't know the real answer, but my guess is that coalition politics required the government at the time to find cabinet positions for their coalition partners. And so we ended up splitting the economic ministries in order to actually, we meaning the government at the time, splitting the economic ministries to accommodate the demands of coalition politics. And once that happened, once you had a Ministry of Petroleum and a Ministry of Coal and a Ministry of Power, all of them are economic ministries. Each of these ministries actually have under their umbrella some of the most powerful and profitable public sector entities. And these are, this makes for a very powerful minister, if you see what I mean. Once you had that split, it became very difficult to bring them back together again. But it made for a fragmented policy towards energy. So the irony of it was that energy was always regarded as one of the most critical issues facing the country, and yet there was no such thing as an energy policy in the country. There was no such thing as an energy minister in the country. There was no one person responsible or accountable for energy other than, if you would, the Prime Minister himself. Even the Planning Commission, this is before it turned into the Niti Aayog, they had a member of energy, but the member energy, who was the level of a Minister of State, did not have executive authority. he could produce a paper called the Integrated Energy Policy of India, but he could not implement it, and other than through the line ministries. And the line ministries decide what to implement and what not to implement. This is maybe not an adequate explanation, but this is the reality today, and this has got to change if we want to address our energy policy in an effective way.
So the answer rests purely on its accommodating rent-seeking
No.
activities and this.
Chatham House rule.
We can. No, I mean, it made no sense to have. It makes no sense to have, because anyone who deals with energy knows that there is a correlation between what you do with petroleum, what you do with coal, or what you do with power. It's correlated. I mean, I write about the subject, and you can't write about renewable energy unless you look at renewable energy and its competitiveness against coal, or its competitiveness against gas. But if the price of coal is determined by one set of people and the price of renewables is determined by another, and never the two don't actually talk to each other, you're going to end up having a problem. And that's what's happened. So you have a problem that, gas prices, for instance, are set by the government of India, or used to be set by the government of India. But coal prices were set by a different ministry. But the two actually was selling to the same consumer. Today, 30,000 megawatts of power capacity is stranded in the country for lack of gas, because the price at which gas was being provided to them earlier was uncompetitive with the price at which they can get coal today. But it was built as a power plant, as a combined cycle, and coal has not been allocated to these power producers. That would not have happened if there was a conversation happening between them. So whether it's rent seeking, whether it was some other reason, but the fact is that this sort of lack of coordination, lack of institutional sort of this institutional cohesiveness is not conducive to the development of sensible energy policy. So we leave it at that. It has to change. I'm just going to say it has to change if we want to. How do we reduce our consumption? Well, but firstly, I was talking about reducing the consumption of oil, not energy. Oil. The government of India is, as I said, importing 82% of its oil. The objective is to reduce that from 82% by 10% to 72%. Now, how do you reduce it? There are three ways of doing it. One is you need to, of course, increase domestic supply. So you need to intensify domestic exploration. Today, the exploration intensity in India is very low. I think it's like 10 wells per 1,000 square kilometers, which is very, very low by any standard. But anyway, they need to intensify exploration, because our hydrocarbon, we have 26 sedimentary basins, and 80% of those sedimentary basins have not been fully explored. So there's one explanation. We need to intensify exploration. Two, and this is of course far more important in my view, because the first is important but it's long term. 2 and 3. One is you have to improve the usage of energy, the efficiency of usage of energy. So there's a lot of wastage because people just don't have a sense of awareness of the importance of energy conservation. It's because government of India also has not placed enough emphasis on energy conservation. They focused a lot of their effort on the supply side of the equation and less so on the demand side. They need to do more. There are very few standards that are implemented. Standards meaning that mandated standards, whether it's to do with energy efficiency, whether it's to do with the automotive. The standards themselves, if they exist, they're not implemented, and in some cases they don't even exist. So there are no standards to do. In some cases, the appliances that we use don't have a particular energy sort of standard. So that has to be done. And the third, of course, is we have to shift away from oil to renewables, to a cleaner, less, to a different fuel base, and which is what we're trying to do. But in order for us to accelerate that shift, we have to improve the infrastructure that is necessary to bring the non-fossil fuel, or non-oil in this case, from the production point to the consumer. So in the case of gas, it means you have to build a gas pipeline network. We have one pipeline going from West India to North India and one going from East India to North India, but no pipelines in South India, gas pipelines, no gas pipelines in East India. So even if you had lots and lots of gas discovered offshore East India, you know, like in Bay of Bengal, let's say Krishna Godavari, you don't have the gas infrastructure, the gas pipeline to bring it to Tamil Nadu or to Kerala or wherever, or Karnataka. So you have to actually do that, invest in that. And secondly, you have to invest in upgrading the transmission network, the grid network. It's no good saying we want to increase the solar generation capacity from 26 gigawatts, which is today, to 100 gigawatts by 2022, if you don't create the transmission network, you know, to allow for the influx of these molecules on an intermittent basis. Remember, solar doesn't flow 24/7. It comes in when the sun is high, and it stops when the sun goes down. So until such time as you have actually created the storage technology that can store the solar molecules, and you've built up the transmission network, you're not going to be able to shift away from oil.
Sticking with oil still, is there a lot of oil consumption outside transport and petrochemicals still in India, in industry or whatever?
Much less so. Transport accounts for about 65% of our oil consumption.
Right.
Okay. And
Power generation?
Yeah. So power generation, almost none. Some of the older, industry is still, using oil.
Okay, because that's something that China's done, is basically it's now just petrochemicals and transport. And of course, another way to raise the production is what you mentioned before, is applying technology to raise production levels, recovery levels in the oil fields. Yes, good. Yes, sir.
My name is Iftikhar Chaudhary. I'm from Bangladesh. Moving to LNG, how do you transport gas from Qatar, for instance? I mean, you need these special hull vessels for that. You said there are no pipelines in India. So isn't there preferred?
I mean, they were not for the east and the west and the south.
But for procurement from Northfield, for instance, isn't pipelines a more preferred method? I spent some years in Qatar, and they prefer to export through pipes. So pipelines. But in India, is there an option?
Well, so Qatar to India is LNG, okay?
Yeah,
so it goes in these cryogenics and vessels. It comes to the west coast of India. There are these 3 terminals, and it gets regasified there. And then there is a pipeline, as I said, which connects from West India, a place called Hazira, all the way up to North India. And then there are these sort of spur lines, which connect. As an aside, I have to say, for those of you interested, that the only state in India which actually has a full gas grid, pipeline grid, is Gujarat. The Prime Minister of India, when he was Chief Minister, actually bypassed the central government and set up this gas grid. And the central government sued him. And he sued him, meaning the Gas Authority of India sued the Gujarat State Petroleum Company. By the time the Supreme Court took a decision, the GSPC had already built the pipeline. That's a matter of interest. But, sorry, I was just going to say, but insofar as pipelines are concerned, and this is, I think, your point, We have been talking,
Because there is a price differential, that's why I asked.
well, no huge price differential. So if you were to take the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline, the TAPI project, which is under construction, Turkmenistan to Afghanistan, and then I'm not sure where to. The price at the border in India is calculated right now at $5.31 a million BTU. The landed price of LNG, not from Qatar, because Qatar there's a long-term supply contract which is actually quite favorable to India, but the landed price of LNG into India based on the spot market is $7.50. So you're absolutely right. Pipeline gas would be cheaper than LNG. The pipelines that we're talking about from Iran have the political issues. The pipeline from Bangladesh, because there again, you see, there is a huge amount of gas in the northeast of India. There's gas in Bangladesh, and Bangladesh has done a good job in actually domestic. There's gas in Tripura and Assam, Tripura in particular, huge gas fields, which are unmonetized because of lack of pipelines and lack of a market. I mean, firstly, lack of a market, domestic market in that particular state, and then lack of pipelines to bring it to the market. So that's my larger point was that if we want to actually create an integrated, if you want to accelerate we want to create a sort of a sustainable energy system in this country, we first have to move away from oil and coal, oil, to gas. There is sufficient gas in the country and within the region for us to actually, really find, to meet our requirements. In order for that, we have to create the gas infrastructure. And subsequently, we have to move towards non-fossil fuels, which is renewables. But it's going to take time. It needs, as I go back, needs us to look at it holistically.
Gentleman there, please. Can you pass the microphone up, please?
So did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Near enough.
One can always continue.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mehta, for a very detailed presentation. I'm Rupak from ISAS. Two questions. One which is related to the earlier question. We have the Modi government has a neighborhood first foreign policy. But coming to the neighborhood, see, Bhutan is very rich in hydroelectricity. Bangladesh has natural gas, as you said. And Myanmar is also rich in natural gas. So wouldn't it be cheaper to get these hydroelectricity from Bhutan and gas from Bangladesh and Myanmar rather than going, say, all the way to, say, Qatar or Australia? So what are the things that are precluding this from happening? And the second question is, does India have strategic oil reserves? And because of the fluctuations in the oil market, the rupee going down, or see you talked about non-Middle East sources like Venezuela, because of the current crisis in Venezuela. In order to tide over this, do we have a plan for this in the future? Thank you.
So as far as Bhutan is concerned, we already have an energy relationship with them. We built a hydroelectric dam some years in Chuka, if I'm not wrong. I think it's called Chuka Dam, yeah. And that not only meets all of Bhutan's electricity requirements, but also actually supplies electricity to India. And we are talking about another fairly major project. We not only, by the way, not only with Bhutan, also with Nepal. Okay, Nepal is the Karnali River project, but Nepal has been dogged by politics, and that I think you'll appreciate that. So it's going to be some time before we can overcome those issues.
Maybe more in Bhutan then?
Yeah, no, Bhutan is. There's a successful model there. It was a model actually that can be replicated in Nepal. It's a working model. It's a successful. The Chuka project is a very successful project, And it's a long-standing project. And there's another one that's coming up. So I think there we have certainly, done the right thing. Well, as far as Bangladesh and Myanmar are concerned, I mean, it's just the same point. If you don't actually build firstly, you've got to have the right political relationship. Let's start with that. You've got to make sure that we are all aligned politically. So, with Bangladesh, there have been political differences. With Myanmar, there have been political issues. And then there's a China factor that always, complicates matters somewhat. But assuming that we can bring ourselves onto the same page as far as politics is concerned, there is also this infrastructural issue. And then there's the market. Gas, unlike oil, requires a market. When you produce gas, it's like you've got to put it into a pipeline. It's got to get to the market all in one sort of integrated way. It's an umbilical cord, almost.
And you've got to have a user at the other
Yeah,
end
that's
who
what I mean.
will pay the price.
You've got to have a user who will pay money, who will pay your return. You can't. Otherwise, oil on the other hand, you can store it, or you can keep it on.
Put it in a ship.
Put it in a ship or go somewhere else. You can't do that with gas, or at least it becomes very uneconomic if you do it. And that's one reason why Tripura gas has been, has not been monetized for literally decades.
Can't it be brought through Bangladesh to Kolkata?
There are lots and lots of solutions if you can sort the politics out. Every single you see, it's like the Iran-India Pakistan gas pipeline. It's on paper a very sensible project. It's been worked to death by every economist who's in this business. The prices are really economic. We've also come up with solutions as to how we can address the security issues. I mean, I myself wrote a paper almost 20 years ago, where I was a naive person then, but where I actually said, and I did the economics on it, you bring the gas to a power plant in Amritsar. In order for the plant to provide electricity to Lahore, okay? So that if the Pakistanis cut the supply of gas, they're actually cutting their nose at the same time, because the supply of electricity to Lahore would be cut. The point being to create interdependencies, and that's one way in which you can actually overcome this concern that people had about building a pipeline across Pakistan. It hasn't gone anywhere. Okay. Now we are talking about, by the way, someone is on the economics on building a underwater pipeline from Chabahar in Afghanistan.
Right.
Sorry, in Iran. What am I saying? In Iran.
Yeah.
So it'll be the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Iran, underwater to India pipeline. So you pass Pakistan, you bypass Pakistan.
So it can be brought from Chabahar to Kandla. You can avoid.
Yeah, that's the pipeline would go, from Chabahar to wherever, Kandla. So there is that now, and that also has now been deemed to be economic. So there are, we could have a whole day of seminar on all the possibilities of monetizing the gas reserves in our region. When Manishankar Iyer was our Minister of Petroleum, and that would have been 2004 or something, I've forgotten, I think 7 or something, yeah? He came up with another idea. He was a Congress politician. He said, create an Asian gas pipeline grid, which would go all the way up to China. So it'll be, Middle East will bring the gas or what, but then you'd have India, you'd have all the, Myanmar, Bangladesh, but China also included. So then and then, of course, going to Southeast Asia. So, you have that. People peg all this on the fact that during the height of the Cold War, Siberian gas flowed
West.
without interruption to Europe. So why can't it happen in our subcontinent? The answer is it can, it should. Who knows?
Your story of your innocence 25 years ago, I was in the Beijing office of BP, and at that time BP held a large part of the Kovitka gas field near Irkutsk on Lake Baikal. And I remember writing a small memo, why don't we use Japanese money and steel to bring gas from that field into China, across Mongolia, okay? This is 1993. Well, anyway, stuff happens in Russia. There isn't the market that will pay in China at the time, and so where the first Russian gas will flow by pipeline next year from Russia to China, 26 years later. And that's a combination of politics and market and whatever. So with gas, stuff takes time. Yeah, unless it happens to be where you can put it on a ship and find a customer out there. Anyway, I think the time is up. I think Mr. Mehta has given us a wonderful sort of encyclopedic and insightful overview of the domestic politics of energy in India, as well as the outgoing politics. And of course, they are connected, so if it's not coordinated internally, it will certainly not be coordinated externally. And we just hope that in his new position at Brookings, he can have some influence over the government and help them make things better. Anyway, Mr. Mehta, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Anyway, now to present you with two books,
Oh, good.
please. One is from ISAS, which is 7 decades of independent India.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
And the other is my own. It's a little out of date. The next edition's coming out in February, of the Governance of Energy in China, Transition to a Low Carbon Economy.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
That's good. I'm glad. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The formal session is over, but do hang around and follow up any questions with Mr. Mehta that you.